With football season upon us now, there's a lot happening in the news, so be sure to subscribe to my other channel, JG9 News, where I give you up-to-the-minute updates on everything happening in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, and I give my thoughts on everything taking place around the National Football League today. And now, on with our feature presentation. August 11th, 2000, a movie would come out and hit the box office that would change the history of sports movies forever, because it was on this day that The Replacements was released. I promise you, I'm going somewhere with this, so just bear with me for the next minute. The movie centered around the Washington Sentinels, in what was a loosely based telling of what happened during the NFL strike in 1987 with the replacement players, right down to the final game, where a Washington team full of scabs has to take on a Dallas team that featured nothing but regular players. The movie got mixed reviews and didn't do a ton at the box office, barely breaking even. But over time, partly because of the lack of football movies to come out in the last 25 years, it has gained a huge following and has become somewhat of a cult classic. To this day, people still talk about Shane Falco at quarterback. To this day, people still talk about Keanu Reeves and the performance that he gave. And yes, The Replacements is a work of fiction. There is no such team as the Washington Sentinels, and there is no such quarterback as Shane Falco. But that doesn't mean that The Replacements didn't impact actual NFL games, and that the fictional movie didn't actually play a huge part in non-fiction events. Because I'm sure the Baltimore Ravens will tell you otherwise. Because as you might already be aware of, or might now just be finding out for the first time based on the shots, The Replacements was largely shot in Baltimore at PSINet Stadium, home of the Ravens. If you were wondering what the stadium used in that movie was, and why it looked vaguely familiar to an NFL stadium, well, that's because it is an NFL stadium, as that's the same stadium that the Ravens play at. But while the Washington Sentinels call PSINet Stadium home in the movie, the Baltimore Ravens call PSINet Stadium home in real life. Managing field conditions is already tough enough, having to deal with weather and whatnot. Managing field conditions at the same time that a movie is being shot at the venue, and you've got loads of equipment being moved around, and people running on the field at all times? Good luck with that, I'll tell you that much, because that is nearly impossible, and that is something that cannot be done. However, what can be done right now is for you to hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. We post every single day about the weird and wacky history of the NFL, so if you like that sort of stuff, especially with football season coming up, then this is the place for you. Thanks in advance for your support as we try and hit 70,000 subscribers. And in 1999, when the Baltimore Ravens took on the Kansas City Chiefs in a game on Thursday Night Football, if you want to call it that, let's just say that the field did not look good and that everyone was slipping all over the place. The game was already bad enough for the Ravens, as we're going to find out in just a bit. But the field? Well, that might have been even worse than the Ravens' performance on the day, which is saying a lot. And 25 years later, in honor of the Ravens and Chiefs opening up the season on a Thursday night, if you're watching as of this video getting released, it feels fitting to do a deep dive into the first time these teams ever met, which happened to be on a Thursday night, and the disaster that the game was. Because this is the story behind what might just be, considering the circumstances, the worst field in Thursday night football history. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand the importance of the game, as well as how the game itself was going. It's October 21st, 1999. It's Week 7 of the NFL season, and we find ourselves at PSINet Stadium for a special Thursday night game between the Baltimore Ravens and the Kansas City Chiefs, with the game being on a Thursday night because there was no Sunday Night Football that week, so as not to conflict with the World Series between the New York Yankees and the Atlanta Braves taking place at the same time. This was common practice back then for the NFL to avoid the World Series, which, man, how the tables have turned, I'll put it that way. Besides the fact that this is a nationally televised game, and the only time that PSINet Stadium will be featured on national TV the entire season, this is a monumental game for the main team in our story, the Baltimore Ravens. After their Week 6 bye, Baltimore enters this game with a 2-3 record in Brian Billick's first season as the head coach. It had been a rough season for Baltimore thus far, especially offensively, where their 77 points scored was the 4th fewest in the NFL at the time. In the AFC, you had 11 teams enter Week 7 with at least 3 wins and fighting for one of 6 playoff spots. Lose this game, and to say that you've got an uphill climb to make it to the postseason would be putting it lightly, because in the ultra-competitive AFC, you'd be falling well off the pace. Your division chances would be shot, as you'd be 2-4 with the Jacksonville Jaguars and Tennessee Titans tied for the AFC Central lead at 5-1. And your wildcard hopes would be hanging on barring a crazy turnaround and a few collapses elsewhere. So you really need to win this game against the 3-2 Chiefs. I do not say that lightly. However, as you can probably tell, that did not happen. It did not come close to happening. In fact, if you asked Ravens fans, the importance of the game notwithstanding, what the worst game they ever played in franchise history was, many of them would probably point to this game. Just in terms of which game they looked the least like an NFL team, which game was never competitive, and which game was the most excruciating to watch, it had to be that 1999 game against the Chiefs, where absolutely nothing went right. Because when the final whistle sounded, the Chiefs were victorious, taking it by a final score of 35-8. Kansas City had not one, but 2 pick sixes. Kansas City's defense actually outscored Baltimore's offense, which is never a good sign. Kansas City led it 28-0 with 4 minutes left, and in the first 3 quarters of the contest, the Ravens had just 150 yards of total offense. That was it. Starting quarterback Stoney Case would be making his final start ever with the Ravens. And after this game, it's not hard to see why Brian Billick made a quarterback change to go with Tony Banks the rest of the way. Case finished the game going 15 for 37, completing just 40% of his passes for 103 yards, no touchdowns, 3 interceptions, and a passer rating of 14.6, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Baltimore turned it over 3 times themselves while forcing none, and the Ravens did not score once on their first 13 drives of the contest. Everything about this game for Baltimore was ugly with a capital U, as the loss in front of a national television audience felt like a death knell to Baltimore's season, as barring anything crazy, the Ravens would be missing the playoffs for the 4th consecutive season to start off their franchise's history. But as you're watching this game, and as you're watching the Ravens completely sting up the joint while the Chiefs just take them to town, you might notice something odd about the field. And you might notice something that does not look even the slightest bit right. And that is the fact that the field is all different shades of green. Why is the field not uniform? Why does the field look like that and just look ugly for television? Why are players slipping and sliding all over the place? Why does the center of the field look like a completely different color than the rest of the field? And why do the seams between the outside and the center look extremely noticeable? Well, PSI Stadium's only nationally televised game of the season looked like such a disaster because of the replacements. Like I said earlier, the movie was being filmed at PSINet Stadium, which was already going to put a heavy burden on the stadium with all the people moving around and with all the people being on the field. Usually, you want to keep people off the field so that it doesn't get destroyed, but PSINet Stadium did not have that luxury. However, what you might not realize is that the movie was being shot there in the middle of the season. That's right, the scenes for the replacements weren't being shot in May or June when no one was using the stadium. They were being shot in the middle of football season, meaning that this was going to impact what was taking place on the field in real life whenever the Ravens played. They did a lot of filming during the bye week. And as you can probably expect, with the movie being shot there, the field was absolutely destroyed, to the point where it was basically unplayable. When Tuesday rolled around, just 48 hours before kickoff, and before the Ravens were set to play the Chiefs in the game you've been watching this whole time, there was no field. The entire center of the field had been destroyed by the movie, including the actors running around and the heavy cameras and machinery being on there. It was just dirt. Now, part of the budget for the movie was for Warner Brothers to pay for any damage to the stadium field, So it's not as though the Ravens were going to have to figure this out with an out-of-pocket expense. But that still doesn't change the fact that the field was unplayable and unusable, and that the center took a beating, a la what happened at Super Bowl 25, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Although while that wasn't noticeable, this one was. Because just 48 hours before kickoff, Bob Hummer, who helped out with the turf of the stadium, had to replace the entire center of the field with replacement squares from a sod farm in Pennsylvania. It was the only way the field was going to be remotely usable. It needed to be replaced just hours before kickoff. And while the good news was that the 344 new squares of turf got there in time for kickoff and were able to be installed, making the football field actually sort of resemble a football field, the bad news was that to say it was hastily done would be putting it lightly. For one, as you can clearly see, the squares were a completely different color. It didn't look even the slightest bit good. The sides were a darker green, while the middle was a significantly lighter green, and you could see the seams between the darker green and the lighter green. How obvious was the difference? How obvious were the turf squares? How poor was the footing? It was so bad and so obvious that even ESPN pointed it out in the middle of their broadcast, as ESPN criticized the field conditions for just not being up to par, and for the field looking like absolute crap. Take a look.
For the St. Louis Rams. Sidearms this one and dropped. Ismail had a shot at it, couldn't hold it.
The one thing that I've noticed, and they put in a new section of the field, and you see so many players slipping and sliding, no matter how long the cleats are. Ismail has slipped. Banks, we saw a slip on that one. We've seen defensive backs go. They filmed a movie here a while back, and you can see the seam running right down there. That's all new, the middle of the field, and it's just slick.
It's the second time they replaced it. The movie people had to replace it twice. $750,000 worth of sod, thank you.
Long movie.
Really?
And Hummer assured everyone that nothing was wrong. Hummer assured everyone that if players slipped on the field, it wasn't his fault for the hasty job, saying, "I can't imagine that there would be a footing problem, and that any players who slipped had it happen because they either used the wrong cleats or because of nighttime dew." All right, now regarding the cleats, you know that analogy with the person who smells, and how if one person smells, that person probably smells. But if every single person that you encounter smells, then you're probably the one who smells? I feel like that absolutely applies here. If one person slips, all right, maybe they were using the wrong cleats. If every single person slips, if there's constant footing issues the entire game, nope, that means that something else is at play. And nighttime dew? Are you kidding me? Nighttime dew? At 8 o'clock at night? I can't remember a single time in my life that I was playing outside at night, whether it was a game of soccer, or a game of manhunt, or a game of football, or a single time that I was just sitting on the lawn growing up and being like, crap, gotta call it off here. The ground is wet due to the nighttime dew. Obviously, dew is a thing, but at 8 o'clock at night? No, it wasn't a dew, I can promise you that. I don't ever recall watching an NFL game with nighttime dew. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't know a whole lot about earth science. I took that in 8th grade, was not my strongest subject. But you know what I do know? That nighttime dew, as wet as it is, can cause seams in the field. Nighttime dew is not the reason that the field looks like it's different colors and that there's seams going right down the centers. You just did a crap job. You did almost as crappy a job as the Ravens. I say almost because the Ravens really did not play well. And at least there was a field that was a shade of green, but it wasn't good. When you're giving two separate justifications that are not even remotely the same, and you're just throwing out words to say why the field didn't play well, you screwed up. When the field looks like two completely different shades of green, you screwed up. And when ESPN's announcers are calling you out, that's when you know you screwed up. Bottom line, you screwed up, and this game was a disaster as a result. As for what happened after the game between these two teams behind me right here, neither the Chiefs nor the Ravens would end up making the playoffs in 1999, as the Chiefs finished the season 9-7, while the Ravens, despite a strong second half to the year relatively speaking, went 8-8 and missed the playoffs by a game. Now, the Ravens would win the Super Bowl in 2000, and the field would look significantly nicer then, not just because they were champions, but because they didn't have a movie being shot there in the middle of the season. And for those wondering, the next time the Ravens played a nighttime home game, or every single time they played a nighttime home game after this for that matter, no, nighttime dew did not play a part in it. Because of course it didn't. We all know nighttime dew wasn't the reason for this. There have been many games played at what is now known as M&T Bank Stadium, as the venue has hosted not just Ravens games for the last quarter century or thereabout, but has hosted playoff games too, including an AFC championship that Raven fans would like to forget. But in the many games played at this venue, I don't think we've ever seen a field look as poor as this one. Of the many games played on a Thursday night throughout NFL history, which admittedly is not the largest sample size because very few games were played on a Thursday night before the 21st century, I don't think we've ever seen a field look as poor as this one. From the quality of the play to the quality of the field, nothing about this Ravens-Chiefs game that you've been watching screamed that it was ready for prime time, especially for Baltimore. Because you know what chicks dig besides scars? A football field that actually looks like a football field. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.